Hollywood has always believed in certain untouchable figures, icons who seem to exist outside the reach of time, illness, and even tragedy. For decades, Barbra Streisand was one of those names. A woman who didn't just survive Hollywood, but controlled it. Every note, every performance, every public appearance was deliberate, calculated, perfected. Nothing about her life ever felt accidental. And standing quietly beside her all these years was James Brolin. Not louder, not more dominant, but steady. Almost invisible in the shadow of her immense presence. The kind of man Hollywood doesn't talk about much. The kind who doesn't need attention to hold everything together. But recently, something has shifted. Not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way. No official statements, no breaking news alerts, just silence. A different kind of silence. The kind that feels heavier the longer it lingers. Because James Brolin has started saying things. Not directly. Not clearly. But enough for people who are paying attention to feel it. In a quiet interview, buried under layers of unrelated conversation, he spoke about time in a way that didn't sound casual. He talked about moments becoming more valuable, about slowing down, about appreciating what's still here, while it's still here. To most people, it sounded like reflection, the words of a man growing older, becoming more thoughtful. But to others, it sounded like something else. It sounded like preparation, because in Hollywood, where every word is filtered, shaped, and controlled, nothing slips out without meaning. Especially not from someone who has spent decades staying composed, staying careful, staying quiet. And that's what makes this different. James Brolin has always been the calm one, the one who doesn't create speculation, the one who avoids the spotlight unless absolutely necessary. So when someone like him starts choosing his words more carefully, when his tone changes, when his presence feels different, people notice. And then there's Barbra, a woman who built her entire identity on control. Control over her image, control over her career, control over how the world sees her. For years, she dictated the narrative. She decided what people knew and what they didn't. But now, the narrative feels like it's slipping. Because there's a question no one is asking out loud. Why have they both become so quiet? There were no major public appearances, no strong statements, no clear updates, just a gradual fading into the background. The kind of disappearance that doesn't feel like a choice, but a necessity. And in an industry obsessed with visibility, disappearing is never random. It means something. Some believe it's simply age, a natural step back after decades in the spotlight. But that explanation feels too simple, too convenient. Because when you listen closely to James Brolin now, really listen, there's something underneath his words. A weight, a hesitation, as if every sentence is being measured against something unspoken, as if he's holding on to something he can't fully say, but can't completely hide either. And that's where the rumors begin. Not from tabloids, not from headlines, but from patterns, from tone, from absence. Because sometimes the loudest stories in Hollywood aren't the ones being reported, they're the ones being avoided. And right now, there's a growing feeling that behind the quiet life of one of Hollywood's most powerful couples, something is happening. Something serious. Something that has forced a man like James Brolin to slowly, quietly start saying goodbye. For decades, their relationship didn't follow the usual Hollywood script. There were no constant scandals, no public breakdowns, no dramatic headlines that defined them. While other couples burned fast and faded even faster, Barbra Streisand and James Brolin built something unusually stable, quiet, almost untouchable. They met later in life, not as reckless young stars chasing fame, but as two people who had already seen what fame could do. They understood the cost, the pressure, the way Hollywood slowly reshapes relationships until there's nothing left. And somehow, they avoided it. Barbra, known for controlling every detail of her career, never lost control of her personal life the way others did. And James, he never tried to compete with her power. He didn't need to. That balance became their strength. But that's also what makes the present feel so different. Because when a relationship is built on control and stability, any shift, no matter how small, becomes impossible to ignore. And people have started noticing those shifts. It wasn't one big moment. No sudden announcement, no dramatic reveal, just a series of small, almost invisible changes. Fewer appearances together, longer gaps between interviews, a different energy when they were mentioned. At first, it was easy to dismiss. After all, time passes, people age, priorities change. But then the tone of James Brolin's words began to change more noticeably. In past interviews, he spoke about Barbra with admiration, sometimes even humor. There was lightness, a sense of ease. Now, there's something heavier, more reflective, more final. He began talking about their life together as if it were something to be looked back on, rather than something still unfolding. He spoke about memories, about gratitude, about how rare it is to find something that lasts. And again, on the surface, it sounded normal, but the context changed everything. Because people started asking a question that no one wanted to say out loud. Why does it feel like he's already looking back, while they're still together? And then there's Barbra, a woman who has always been present, even when she chose privacy. You could feel her influence, her control, her presence in everything around her. But recently, that presence feels distant, not gone, just quieter, less visible. And for someone who built an empire on being seen and heard exactly the way she wanted, that kind of quiet doesn't happen by accident. It suggests something deeper, something internal, something that doesn't fit into press releases or carefully managed public statements. And this is where the story starts to shift. Because in Hollywood, when powerful people go silent, it's rarely because nothing is happening. It's usually because something is happening that they can't control. And that's the part that changes everything. Because for the first time in decades, it feels like Barbra Streisand may be facing something that even she cannot manage. Something that doesn't respond to influence. Something that doesn't follow scripts. Something that doesn't care about legacy, reputation, or power. And if that's true, then James Brolin's quiet, measured words aren't just reflections. They're signals. Subtle, careful, but impossible to ignore once you see them. Signals that behind the calm surface of one of Hollywood's most enduring relationships, a reality is unfolding, a reality that no amount of control can stop. And the closer people look, the more it begins to feel like this isn't just a period of silence, it's the beginning of a goodbye. And the most unsettling part is, no one can point to a single moment where everything changed. There was no announcement. No confirmed diagnosis made public, no official timeline, just a growing sense that something behind the scenes no longer fits the image the world has known for years. Because when you look closely at Barbra Streisand's recent presence, it doesn't disappear completely. It fades. And fading is different. Fading is controlled, gradual, almost intentional, as if the goal isn't to alarm people, but to slowly adjust them to a new reality. And that's what makes the rumors more persistent. Not louder, just harder to ignore. Because in an industry built on visibility, when someone like Barbra begins to step back without explanation, it creates a vacuum. And in that vacuum, people start connecting dots. Old interviews are revisited. Past statements are reinterpreted. Moments that once felt normal begin to feel like early signs. And right in the middle of all of it is James Brolin. Still composed, still careful, but no longer unreadable. Because there's one pattern that keeps repeating in everything he says now: time. He talks about it more often, not in a philosophical way, but in a way that feels urgent. As if time is no longer something that stretches endlessly forward. As if it's something that's suddenly limited, measured, valuable in a way it wasn't before. And that shift is subtle, but powerful. Because people who feel like they have time don't speak like that. People who feel like they're running out of it do. And then there are the pauses. The moments where he stops just slightly longer than expected. Where his words seem chosen not just carefully, but emotionally. As if behind every sentence, there's something he's deciding not to say. Something too heavy to put into words. something that would change how everything is seen, if it were spoken out loud. And that's where the phrase begins to take on a different meaning. Tragic diagnosis. It hasn't been officially confirmed. It hasn't been clearly defined, but it exists in the background, in the way people talk, in the way conversations shift when her name comes up, in the way silence fills the space where details should be. And sometimes, silence says more than confirmation ever could, because confirmation ends speculation. Silence feeds it. And right now, the silence surrounding Barbra Streisand feels deliberate, not accidental, not careless, but protective, as if the truth, whatever it is, isn't something meant for the public, at least not yet. But even without confirmation, the emotional reality is already starting to surface. Because when James Brolin speaks now, it no longer feels like he's talking about the future. It feels like he's holding on to the present, carefully, intentionally, as if every moment matters more than it used to. And that's not something you do without a reason. That's something you do when you know something is coming, something inevitable, something you can't stop. And maybe that's why this story doesn't feel like a scandal. It doesn't feel explosive. It doesn't feel chaotic. It feels quiet, heavy, personnel, the kind of story that doesn't unfold in headlines, but in moments, in tone, in absence, in the things people don't say. And the more you watch, the more you listen, the clearer it becomes. This isn't just about rumors. It's about a shift, a slow, almost invisible transition from what was to what's coming next. And if you follow that shift closely enough, you start to understand something unsettling. James Brolin isn't just reacting to a situation. He's preparing for it, not publicly, not dramatically, but in the only way someone like him ever would, quietly, carefully, and one word at a time. He's getting ready to let go. What makes this even more difficult to understand is how carefully everything is being held together. Because from the outside, nothing is falling apart. There are no visible cracks, no emotional breakdowns, no desperate attempts to explain or clarify what's happening. If anything, the image remains composed, controlled, almost unchanged. And that's exactly what makes it feel different. Because when something truly serious begins to unfold in the lives of people who have spent decades controlling every detail, the first instinct isn't to reveal it. It's to protect it, to contain it, to make sure the world sees only what they are allowed to see. And that's the pattern that seems to be forming around Barbra Streisand. Not disappearance, but protection. A layer placed between her reality and the public. And standing at the edge of that layer is James Brolin, not pushing attention away aggressively, not denying anything directly, but guiding the narrative, just enough to keep it from going too far. Because if you listen closely, he never corrects the speculation. He simply doesn't feed it. And that's a very specific choice, because denial would shut everything down. But silence keeps things controlled, and control has always been at the center of their world. But control has limits, and that's where this story becomes something deeper than just rumor, because there's a quiet contradiction starting to appear. On one side, you have decades of precision, a life carefully managed, every detail aligned, every outcome anticipated. On the other side, something unpredictable, something that doesn't respond to planning, something that forces even the most controlled people into uncertainty. And when those two forces meet, something has to give. Not loudly, not suddenly, but gradually, almost invisibly. And that's what this feels like. Not a collapse, but a slow release. A shift from holding everything together to quietly accepting that not everything can be held. And that acceptance often shows up in the smallest ways, in how someone speaks, in how they pause, in what they choose to emphasize. And lately, James Brolin has been emphasizing something very specific. Not fear, not panic, but presence. He talks about being there, about showing up, about appreciating what's in front of him. And that might sound simple, but it isn't, because people don't suddenly start focusing on presence unless they've been reminded that it won't last forever. And that's where the emotional weight of this story really begins to settle. Because this isn't about headlines. It isn't about confirming details. It's about understanding a feeling. The feeling that something is changing, quietly, but permanently. The feeling that behind the calm, measured words, there's a reality being faced one day at a time. And the feeling that, for the first time in a very long time, James Brolin isn't just living his life beside Barbra Streisand. He's preparing for a version of life without her. Not because he wants to, not because he's ready, but because somewhere deep beneath the silence, he understands something the rest of the world is only beginning to sense. And that understanding doesn't show up as drama. It shows up as restraint, as patience, as a kind of quiet strength that only appears when someone is facing something they cannot change. And maybe that's why this story feels so different from everything else Hollywood produces. Because it isn't trying to entertain. It isn't trying to shock. It's simply unfolding, slowly, quietly, and with a weight that becomes heavier the more you pay attention. Because the truth is, sometimes the most powerful goodbyes aren't the ones that are announced. They're the ones that are felt long before they're ever spoken. And as this quiet shift continues, something even more subtle begins to emerge. A pattern not just in what is being said, but in what is no longer being shared. Because for someone like Barbra Streisand, absence is never random. Every public appearance she has ever made carried intention. Every word, every image, every moment was part of a larger narrative she controlled with precision. That level of control doesn't just disappear overnight. So when it changes, it means something forced it to change. And that's the part no one can fully explain. Because there's no official statement confirming anything serious. No timeline, no details, just distance. A growing space between who she was and how often she is seen now. And in that space, people begin to notice something else. Not just her absence, but his presence, because James Brolin hasn't stepped away. If anything, he feels more visible in the few moments he does appear. Not louder, not more expressive, but more present, as if he's carrying something, not physically, but emotionally, as if part of his role has shifted from partner to protector, from companion to someone quietly holding everything together while something else unfolds behind the scenes. And that kind of shift doesn't happen without reason. Because when life is stable, roles don't change. But when something begins to break that stability, people adapt, quietly, instinctively, without needing to explain it. And that's exactly what this feels like. Adaptation. Not to a public crisis, but to a private reality, a reality that hasn't been confirmed, but is slowly becoming impossible to ignore. Because there's one detail that keeps resurfacing in everything surrounding this story, not directly stated, but implied. A diagnosis. Something serious enough to change routines. Serious enough to reduce visibility. Serious enough to shift the way time is being experienced inside that relationship. And yet, still unspoken. Still protected. And maybe that's intentional, because some truths, once spoken, become permanent. They change how people look at you. They change how every moment moving forward is interpreted. And for someone who has spent a lifetime controlling perception, that might be the one thing she's not ready to surrender. So instead, there is silence. Carefully maintained, carefully managed, but no longer completely convincing. Because the emotional signals are already there. In the way James Brolin speaks now, there's a quiet acceptance, not defeat, but awareness, as if he understands the direction things are moving, even if he doesn't say it out loud. And that awareness changes everything. Because when someone begins to accept something difficult, they stop trying to fight it in the same way. They stop focusing on control and start focusing on meaning, on moments, on presence. And that's exactly where he seems to be now, not trying to explain, not trying to correct, just being there, fully, carefully, as if every day carries a weight it didn't carry before. And that's when the story stops feeling like speculation and starts feeling like something much more real. Because rumors can be loud, they can be exaggerated, they can be wrong. But feelings like this kind of quiet, consistent shift, it's much harder to fake. And the more you observe it, the more one possibility begins to take shape. Not confirmed, not declared, but understood that whatever is happening behind closed doors is serious enough to change the way a man like James Brolin lives his life. Serious enough to make him speak differently, think differently, be differently. And maybe that's the clearest signal of all. Because when someone who has spent decades staying steady begins to change, it's rarely without a reason. And that reason, whatever it truly is, feels closer now than ever before. Closer to the surface. Closer to being understood. And yet still just far enough away to remain unspoken. For now. And then there's a moment that changes how everything is interpreted. Not because it reveals the truth, but because it reveals how close they might be to it. In a recent conversation, when James Brolin was asked about the future, he didn't answer the way he used to. There was no long-term vision. No excitement about what's next. No sense of something being built or planned years ahead. Instead, he paused, just long enough to feel it. And then he spoke about now, about today, about the importance of not taking ordinary moments for granted. And for most people, that might sound like wisdom. But in this context, it feels like something else. Because people who are certain about the future don't anchor themselves so heavily in the present. They don't speak as if time has suddenly become fragile. They don't choose their words as if every sentence carries weight beyond what is being said. But he does now. And that shift is impossible to ignore once you notice it. Because it doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from awareness. From knowing something that hasn't been fully shared. From standing close to a reality that most people aren't allowed to see yet. And that's where the emotional core of this story begins to settle in. Because this isn't about a sudden goodbye. It's about a slow one. The kind that happens in stages. Quietly. Internally. Long before the world ever hears about it. And if you look at the way things are unfolding around Barbra Streisand, it starts to follow that exact pattern. First, a reduction in visibility. Then, a shift in tone. Then, a silence that feels intentional. And finally, a change in the way the person closest to her begins to speak. Not dramatically, not emotionally, but differently. And sometimes, different is all you need to understand that something deeper is happening. Because when someone like James Brolin begins to subtly reframe his life around presence instead of future, it suggests that the future no longer feels as certain as it once did. And that realization doesn't come easily. It comes slowly, through moments, through conversations that don't go the way they used to, through realizations that can't be undone once they arrive. And maybe that's why everything still feels so controlled on the surface. Because control is the last thing people hold on to. When everything else starts to slip, the routines stay. The appearances remain limited but composed. The silence is maintained. But underneath all of it, there's a shift that can't be reversed. Because once someone begins preparing emotionally, they've already crossed a line between what was and what's coming next. And James Brolin feels like he's standing right on that line, not stepping away, not breaking down, just standing there, holding steady, doing what he has always done. But now, with a deeper understanding of what it means to lose something you still have. And that's what makes this story so difficult to ignore. Because it isn't driven by confirmation. It isn't built on headlines. It exists in the space between what is said and what is felt. In the quiet transformation of a man who has spent decades staying consistent, now slowly adjusting to something he cannot change. And maybe that's the real goodbye. Not the moment it happens, But the moment you realize it's coming and begin to live differently because of it, and the closer this quiet story moves toward its inevitable conclusion, the more it begins to feel less like speculation and more like recognition. Recognition of something that has already begun, even if it hasn't been named. Because at a certain point, you stop looking for confirmation. You start reading the atmosphere, the tone, the weight behind words that used to feel light. And right now, everything surrounding Barbra Streisand and James Brolin carries that weight. Not overwhelming, not dramatic, but constant. Like something sitting just beneath the surface, shaping everything without ever fully revealing itself. And maybe that's why no one close to them is rushing to clarify anything. Because clarity would change everything. It would turn a private reality into a public timeline. It would shift sympathy into scrutiny. And it would force moments that are still personal into something the world feels entitled to witness. So, instead, there is distance. A quiet agreement, it seems, to let things unfold without explanation. To protect whatever time remains from becoming a spectacle. And when you look at it that way, the silence starts to make sense. Because this isn't about hiding the truth. It's about preserving something fragile. Something that becomes more valuable. The closer it is to being lost. And that realization changes how you see James Brolin. Because his role no longer feels like just a husband standing beside one of Hollywood's most powerful women. It feels like something deeper, something heavier. A quiet responsibility to carry not just the present, but the emotional weight of what's coming next. And he does it the only way he knows how. Without performance, without dramatics, without turning it into something the world can easily consume. Just by being there. Consistently, calmly, as if holding the moment together is the only thing that matters now. And that kind of presence doesn't come from uncertainty. It comes from understanding. From knowing, at some level, that things are changing in a way that cannot be reversed. And when that understanding settles in, people don't panic. They don't always speak. They don't always explain. Sometimes they just become more intentional, more aware, more focused on what's still within reach. And that's exactly what this feels like. Not a reaction, but an adjustment. A quiet, internal shift from expecting time to valuing it. And maybe that's why this story resonates the way it does. Because it isn't loud. It isn't chaotic. It isn't built on shock. It's built on something much more familiar. The realization that even the strongest, most controlled lives are still vulnerable to things no one can manage. And when that reality arrives, it doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just changes the way people live, the way they speak, the way they hold on to each other a little more carefully than before. And that's where everything seems to be now. Not at the end. Not yet. But no longer at the beginning either. Somewhere in between, where nothing is officially over, but nothing feels entirely the same. And in that space, a quiet goodbye is already taking shape. Not spoken, not confirmed, but felt. In every pause, in every careful word, in every moment that suddenly matters more than it used to. Because sometimes the most powerful endings don't arrive all at once. They unfold slowly, until one day you realize they've been happening all along. And maybe the most difficult part of all of this is not what's happening. It's what isn't being said. Because in a world where everything is shared, analyzed, and turned into headlines within minutes, this kind of silence feels almost unnatural, deliberate, protected, as if there is an invisible line, and no one close to Barbra Streisand is willing to let the world cross it. And that tells you something. Because when people choose silence over explanation, it's rarely because there's nothing to explain. It's because the truth is too personal, too heavy, or too final to be turned into something public. And that's where the emotional weight of this story quietly reaches its peak. Because by now, it's no longer about guessing what the diagnosis might be. It's about understanding what it has already changed. The rhythm of their lives, the way time is experienced, the way conversations are held, and sometimes avoided. And most of all, the way James Brolin carries himself now. Because if you strip away the speculation, the rumors, the unanswered questions, what remains is something very real. A man who sounds like he's holding on to something. Not tightly, not desperately, but carefully, as if he knows that forcing it would only make it slip away faster. And that kind of awareness doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from moments, from realizations, from the quiet understanding that some things don't need to be said out loud to be true. And maybe that's why there hasn't been a dramatic reveal. No confirmation. No clear ending. Because some stories aren't meant to be told all at once. Some stories are lived day by day, moment by moment, until eventually the world catches up to what was already happening in private. And by then, the goodbye has already been said. Not in words, but in the way people change, in the way they slow down, in the way they start to notice things they once overlooked, in the way they begin to treat time as something rare. And that's exactly what this feels like now. Not an ending that arrives suddenly, but one that has been unfolding quietly all along. And if you've been paying attention from the beginning, if you've listened to the tone, the pauses, the absence, then you realize something that most people are only just starting to sense. This was never about a single moment. It was never about one announcement. It was about a transition, a slow, almost invisible shift from certainty to acceptance. And once that shift happens, there's no going back, because acceptance changes everything. It doesn't stop the outcome, but it changes how people face it, how they carry it, how they live in the time that remains. And that's where James Brolin seems to be now, not trying to explain, not trying to control, just present, steady, quietly preparing for something he cannot stop, but refuses to face without meaning. And maybe that's the final truth behind all of this. Not the rumors, not the diagnosis, not the speculation, but the way a man chooses to stand beside the person he loves when time itself begins to feel uncertain. Because in the end, that's what this story has always been about. Not the goodbye itself, but everything that happens just before it.